This is a tough one, I must admit. Upon my first viewing of Not Asking for Trouble, I was rather intrigued by the conflict, trying to figure out how are they going to end this. And when everything was wrapping up, I can remember thinking to myself, wait, that's it? Really? Not the best first impression, mind you. However, upon some reflection, I think there may be more here than first meets the eye. Maybe. But let's start from the beginning. Pinkie Pie has been invited back to Yakistan for a special holiday, and to be honest, a lot of how much you'll enjoy this episode has to do with how you reacted to the Yaks last time. They may not be quite as destructive this time around, but they are still very stubborn and prideful. And if you aren't a fan of their mannerisms, then I don't suppose there will be much to like with this story. However, Pinkie Pie is certainly entertaining regardless of whether she's interacting with the main six, Prince Rutherford and the Yaks, or even just Gummy out in the middle of nowhere. Even if you're not a fan of the conflict, I'd say this episode is worth a watch, if only to see Pinkie being Pinkie. Although, speaking of, let's talk about that central conflict, shall we? It is interesting to see a different culture in the world of Equestria, complete with unique customs and traditions. And I'm glad that Pinkie was able to tone down a lot of her overly excitable nature and channel it towards a good purpose in learning how to be respectful towards those she's trying to befriend. In the past, she wasn't always so good with that aspect, so it's nice to see some character progression. When the avalanche comes along, though, it's kind of hard not to question things. These Yaks must have been living around here for quite some time, and they've never had to deal with snow this deep? Despite their rituals making so much of a ruckus? I suppose since Pinkie was around, they might have been putting on much more of a show in order to impress their visitor, which in turn caused an avalanche far greater than any other they've seen before. But I still have to question it. At any rate, Pinkie is showing remarkable restraint and patience given what she has to work with. She got to work clearing snow along with the rest of the Yaks, was not quick to assume that the prince didn't know what he was talking about, and even went along with his prideful arrogance when she believed it was what all the Yaks wanted. It was only after she discovered that the children were suffering and too afraid to speak up about it, along with the rest of the tribe if you take a closer look, that she decided more drastic action was necessary. And this was rather crucial because otherwise the ending message would be a lot more muddled. However, as it stands, Pinkie is still going against the wishes of a ruler in his own homeland. And such an example could be interpreted in all kinds of ways. It still gives me a bit of pause each time I go back to this story. Now, this is not to say that Pinkie wasn't making some good choices here. Even when the prince threw her out, and she had every right to be furious over it, she was still able to step back and admit that her frustrations wouldn't help anyone in need. She was still determined to help. But when she was confronted by the prince, she was also attempting to hide her actions. And I can't help but feel the story could have used a moment where Pinkie was prepared to accept the consequences of her actions regardless of the good she was doing. However, that moment didn't seem all that necessary when the prince immediately comes up and claimed that she was in the right all along by helping when he himself had expressed many times that that was not what he wanted. And the first time I watched this scene, I was just scratching my head trying to understand the message being conveyed here. On the surface, it does seem to promote an idea that you need to help others regardless of however they feel about it. And while the intentions may be honorable, I can still think of some circumstances where that would encourage a dangerous mindset. Although, when I looked back at the prince's actions throughout the whole of the story, I believe there are some subtleties that add a good deal of depth. When Pinkie arrived in Yakistan, she was being given the greatest comforts the Yaks had to offer. Yes, she needed to respect their customs, but imagine for a moment that every one of those comforts was considered a great luxury for the Yaks. something that perhaps was extremely rare for any one of its citizens. Now imagine that the prince insisted on his people giving everything they had in order to leave the best of impressions on this very rare visitor from the outside world. I mean, think back to when the prince visited Ponyville and saw firsthand just how much these equestrians had in abundance. It would make sense the prince would hope to follow suit with what little his village had to offer. Now, think about this avalanche that suddenly ruined everything. As someone who was given so much on his first visit to Ponyville, and even more so as the ruler of Yak-Yakistan, how would you feel in that moment? What would you do? To be honest, I think I can understand his desire to not seem weak, to make it look like this disaster is no big deal. I may not agree with his choices, but with this added context, I feel as though I can better understand his motivations behind them. And even at the end, when he comes out and congratulates Pinky for helping when he had repeatedly made it clear how much he didn't want it, I believe this is actually his own stubborn, arrogant way of admitting that he had made a mistake and had learned a valuable lesson in the process. Now, is this what the writers had in mind when they were putting this story together? Maybe? I don't actually know if there's anything to prove what I've stated here. In the end, it's all just a theory which happens to fit the facts. If this isn't what the MLP staff had in mind, then the ending seems a bit muddled in my opinion. If it is, however, perhaps there are more to these simple stories than what first meets the eye. What do you think, though? Which elements of this episode stood out the most to you on your first viewing? Did any of your opinions change when you went back and took a closer look? I would like to hear your thoughts on Not Asking for Trouble, and let us hope for even more episodes in MLP that make you step back and consider what the right course of action could be. I am Dr. Wolf, and I look forward to hearing from you.